Hello, I am here with Jack Maher. He is a former journalist, now author, and we are going to be talking a little bit about his career through the journalism field, and then also his current book that it is current, right? It is a recent release.
You
Yes.
are correct. I've got
Uh,
two, but yes, that's correct.
so the first thing I wanted to ask you was, you spent a long time with the whole journalism like that in that field. And I want to know, when did it first kind of interest you? Was it like from a very young age, or was it something that you kind of came upon?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'll tell you, growing up, my dad, who was also named Jack, was actually part of the golden age of TV. And while I was born here in Colorado, we moved out to Hollywood so he could pursue his dream of being a writer. And so for a while, he was involved in some 50s production, including a show called Love That Bob, which at the time was kind of innovative when you think about it. It was about a fashion photographer who flew around to various fashion shoots in a flying car that actually did fly. And it was a 50s version. It wasn't like a Marty McFly type DeLorean by any means. It was almost like a Mini Cooper, and then you strapped the wings to it, and it actually did fly. I don't know how safe it was, but that was sort of the gambit, the plot for this show. Anyway, I think that's kind of a little bit of how I came to get involved in this crazy world. Uh, my memory of really when I understood the power of storytelling was when I came home from school one day and I said, Dad, I have to do a book report. And at the time, my favorite book was something called Tom Swift. It was a series of books for young readers. And this was about this brilliant young scientist who was always building telescopes and rocket ships and submarines. And he said, well, why don't you try a shoebox theater? And I said, well, what's that? And he said, well, you just take a shoebox and you empty it out and you turn it over and you cut a couple of slots in the bottom and then get yourself a piece of cash register tape. I'm really dating myself with this. And then you draw scenes from the book onto this cash register tape and you kind of pull it through these slots in the bottom of the shoebox. You talk about the book. I said, okay, let me try that. That was kind of a fun project. And so when I got up in front of the fifth grade and did that, I got a standing O. I really thought it was pretty cool. And I think from that moment on, I realized, putting pictures and these words together kind of is something cool. Well, fast forward to high school, and I had a journalism teacher. Her name was Mrs. Mack, and she was marvelous. She instructed us in all the basics of classic journalism, the inverted pyramid and the who, what, where, when, why. And I never gave much thought to doing anything other than newspaper because I really thought that was a great profession to be in. Well, this particular day, it was spring, and I want to say it was probably in 1970. Anyway, she looked out the window and there was a news crew from the local TV station that was loading up its gear. They'd come to our high school in Denver to do some sort of story. Mrs. Mack opened the window and shouted down and said, hey, we're a journalism class. Can you come up and talk to us? Sure enough, they did. Reporter's name was Ron Mitchell. The photographer's name was Butch Montoya, and they told us about, a typical day in their life. And I'm telling you, I was just transfixed by hearing about, the challenges of what they did. They were shooting film at the time, but being on deadline, the adrenaline of trying to meet these deadlines and how to tap dance when things went wrong. Well, I ended up working at that station. It took me a while, the station that they came from. At the time was called KBTV. The BTV stood for Better Television. And I ended up, believe it or not, being the supervisor of that reporter, Ron Mitchell, and a colleague of the photographer, Butch Montoya. I couldn't believe it. Here I was, this high school kid. And then all these years later, I end up not only, helping to work with them on these deadlines, but I'm supervising one of them. And that really was the turning point for me, was that one day in Mrs. Mack's journalism class. And I ended up at KBTV, which later changed its call letters to KUSA TV. And I was with them for 34 years. So I was there from the beginning of film all the way through to digital madness and multi-platforming. So I felt very lucky that I had that opportunity.
Would you say the newsroom has changed over the years? Because I've been able to like ask questions to a couple of anchors and people that work in like news stations before. How would you say it's like drastically changed since like from you when you first started to like when you?
Well, I would just say that in terms of the gatekeeping, it seems like that has really changed for both good and bad. When I first started in 1980, we had to make sure our scripts went through an executive producer. And he had a red pen, and he looked at what you'd written, and he wanted to make sure that it fulfilled certain targets in terms of accuracy and fairness. And I, was very proud when one of my scripts made it through his hands, and even prouder when after the show we'd do a post show and we'd sit as a group talking about the newscast. And if something I had done was singled out for being a particularly good piece of work, it really made me proud. And I think the reason that that system worked so well, there wasn't a whole lot of product being put out. I was hired actually to start a morning show, which was just a half hour. But back in 1980, besides that morning show, we had a noon show, a 5 o'clock, and a 10. Well, as things progressed and, local news became more profitable, more product needed to be created. The hours were expanded. We actually ended up acquiring a second TV station. We called it a duopoly. And we were broadcasting a ton of newscasts across these two channels, in addition to adding in around, the 2000s digital. So we were pushing out stuff onto the website and onto different social media channels. And because of the pace required to keep up with all that content, the quality suffered. It really did. And I will just tell you honestly, as a former news executive, that I had reservations, which I did not keep quiet, about the fact that we were asking our talent, in particular, in the midst of a newscast, to be pushing out messaging on social media. Hey, join us the next hour when we've got this great blah, blah, blah. And we really did our best, given, the pressures of all of that, but it suffered. Remarkably, the station did great work in spite of all of that. And I think one of the reasons was we still had a core group of folks that had been there for years that were still trying to preserve the legacy of the folks that came before. And we had a sign on the newsroom that is still there to this day: accuracy first. That's the first thing you saw when you walked into our newsroom. And at the editorial meetings, we had vigorous, good editorial meetings debating the merits of a story or putting resources to a particular story. But inevitably, when you're under this 24/7 deadline, it's going to suffer. And compounding that, was the competition from, mobile devices when people started getting the ability to have their own newsrooms and their own voices. And that was good in many ways because it gave voices that were on the margins a chance to be part of the conversation. But in other ways, especially with the creep of AI and everything else, and people started coming in with agendas, and truth became negotiable. It now looking back, I didn't think of it at the time, but I felt I was just trying to keep up. But looking back, it was kind of the golden age for a lot of us when we still had, reasonable standards to pursue, and I think did a pretty remarkable job, all things considered. Tough business. Model isn't working like it once did. And, economically, we're seeing a lot more consolidation, fewer voices, and there are still people out there who are doing remarkable work on their own without the backing of some big corporation. But you got to be careful about, what you're consuming and just make sure that you're checking everything. That's what that's the world we're in now.
Now you mentioned a lot about you mentioned the duopoly, about just like things, people being like kind of spread a little thin. Did they have to like, in turn, would they like hire on more people, and that made it feel less like a family? Would you say, because like there were all these different people coming around, and you didn't know them as many, or you weren't able to connect as much because they were always working?
I wouldn't say that we added a whole lot of resource because, again, the economics weren't necessarily pointing up to that. What we ended up doing was, the people that we did have, we worked ourselves to exhaustion. That's the honest truth of it. And there just is only so much control you can exercise as a news manager over that aspect of the business because the deadlines are always there. It's not like you can just, I need a breather. I need to get to walk away from this. And I think it really got to the point 14. So it's been a while since, I was in a newsroom, but I'm not sure things have changed that drastically. That I just thought for my sanity, and I remember coming home and talking to my late wife, Becky, and I said, I need to get out. I can't continue at this pace. And the product is suffering and I'm suffering mentally and physically. And so, it was a hard choice to make, but I had to retire.
And is that kind of what inspired the whole like kind of change to writing? You just felt like you still wanted to pursue something like some sort of creative means, but you just want to do it
Yeah,
basically on your own pace and time.
that's exactly right. And actually, before I became a novelist, a book writer, I did have a chapter as a multimedia journalist for a school district. And that's kind of interesting how that came about because it's kind of a small universe. The people that work in TV generally know each other on some level. And so one of my colleagues also left the business and ended up working for a school district for Jeffco Public Schools here in Colorado, second largest school district. At the time, it had 86,000 students. And she was in the communications department. She was heading it up. And she and I connected, and she said, we're looking to expand our footprint, our video footprint. Would you have any interest? And, I had spent years as a reporter and a photographer before I got into news management. And our philosophy at the station was, everybody has the capability of being a storyteller. So we all kept our hand in it on some level. I even went out and did series and special assignments. And I thought, wow, you know what? This sounds pretty cool because Jeffco, just has a special place in my heart. And the reason is Columbine High School. As we all know, it was the site of that infamous 1999 massacre. I was producing that day. It went down. And the craziness of TV news is summed up by my experience. I'd sent a news crew out to cover the opening of a Club Disney, which was a mall-based little fun family activity for, different locations around the country. So I sent the crew in a live truck out to Club Disney. And in the midst of getting ready for that, we started hearing reports on the scanner of shots, trench coats, long guns. Broke down the crew, sent them out to Columbine High, sent our helicopter, a Jet Ranger, to cover it. And before you know it, this crew, which was all set to do this happy story about Club Disney, is in the midst of Columbine chaos. That's all you need to know about local news and how it can flip on a dime. Well, after being on the air for hours and hours of that coverage and just seeing the evil that was perpetrated that day, I came home. I had kids in high school at the time, and I just curled up into a fetal position and I just wept. I could not believe the cruelty that had been perpetrated in a public school. Well, so when Jeffco came calling and I thought of that, I thought, well, maybe this is a way because they had become known for Columbine and not much else. And I thought, I know there's a lot more going on in that school district. And if I can help them show the world these other things, that they're not just about Columbine High School. And even the Columbine story, which transcended that tragedy. There's a lot of good going on at that school, and think of the leaps they had to make to get past that day to still be in the world of teaching young people and inspiring them and lifting them up. And so I accepted that position. I was with them for 7 years. And one of the projects I did about 1,000 stories. I started a YouTube channel, did about 1,000 stories on different schools and teachers and projects. One of them was on the 20th anniversary of the shootings. And the high school wanted me to do the last public anniversary piece in 2019 because they had done this thing where they gathered at Clement Park near the school every year to think about, what had happened that day. And it was a day of service for the students. They would go out and do community projects to, again, try to emphasize the good. And I decided for the 20th piece, rather than even, really talk about the horror of that day, that I would create a love letter from the class of 2019 to the class of 1999. And I worked with the families of the students who died that day and the one teacher. And they gave me some beautiful home video of their kids. Hmm. And then I got contemporary kids from the class of 2019 to talk about the things that they were proud of their school, and the things that had changed since that day in terms of Columbine's heart. And I was in the library of the school, and I should mention that the day of the massacre, much of the killing happened in the library, but they had transformed it architecturally so it wasn't in the same space anymore. So they had a new library. But I was in there with a lot of these families, and it was an 8-minute piece I called Rebel Strong. You can find it on YouTube. And my heart was beating out of my chest. I mean, I had done thousands of hours of content over my career in broadcasting. But this was big. There was a lot at stake. I wanted to make this right. So I played it. We had a big screen. I didn't even look up. I was kind of afraid to engage with the faces of the parents. And when it was over, I just heard silence. I thought, wow, I must have blown it. Then I looked up and there were tears streaming down the faces of these parents. And they thanked me for what I had done for this love letter. And they showed it at this final outdoor commemoration in Clement Park, and the governor and the Lakewood mayor, they were all out there. And I felt probably most proud of that piece than anything I'd ever done. And I was lucky enough to get 4 Emmys during the course of my career, but that was the high point for me. So that was my transition from that until book writing. And the reason I left the school district was just physically. I mean, I was carrying gear, I was flying drones, I was doing a bunch of stuff, and I just realized, okay, I am 65. I think this is enough. And again, just trying to self-preserve a little bit, that I wanted to try to still have enough energy to continue doing something else. So I retired from that. But I'm so lucky I had that chapter as well.
Then At what point do you move back to Colorado? Is it when that whole school district job comes about?
No, I actually was only in California for a short period. My dad struggled with alcoholism, and he kept getting fired from his different jobs. So he moved us back to Denver, where we had some kind of a support system. So I was young. I was in fifth grade when we came back. And so, I was born here, moved briefly, but then came back here. So for the most part, born and raised in Colorado. I did have to, go out of state for my education and to, work on small market TV and radio so I could make the leaps back to a station the size of what we had in Denver. Yeah, Colorado's really my home, and I'm a fifth generation guy here, and my ancestors, they go back to the 1800s, so deep roots, deep roots.
Yeah, I myself, like, my parents are kind of from like different areas. So I'm from like the Inland Empire originally, which is in California. And I've always find it interesting for people that like have lived like kind of in the same area for like multiple generations of their lives and stuff like that, and how their perspective changes like worldview wise. And
Yeah, and that definitely happened to me. I mean, I when I went to school, I went to a place called Las Cruces, New Mexico, southern New Mexico, and it's as far removed in terms of the topography as anything you can get in Colorado. I mean, we have desert environments here, but nothing like what they have in Las Cruces. And culturally, I was fortunate that at the time I was pretty fluent in Spanish, but artistically, it just I would just say that when you have that opportunity to change your environment that way, I think it does fire up a whole new thing in your brain that is so beneficial and puts you in contact with things that you might not otherwise come into contact with. So I'm a big fan of when you can, trying to relocate and learn and absorb things that hopefully will help you later in life in terms of your flexibility and the way you respond.
I do want to get to Poppy though.
Mhm.
I'd love to talk a little more about that book, what went into writing that, because I know it's like you have like a familial connection to it, of course, because it's based on a family member. And do you mind just giving like a brief synopsis for people, and then just kind of talking about like what went into like writing that?
You bet. You bet. So basically, this is about a guy who revolutionized the way art museums looked at Native American art. And his name was Eric Douglas. And he rode on horseback with his father to get to know the land and the people of the Southwest. And this was in the early to mid 20th century. And this man happened to be my grandfather. And we called him Poppy. And I didn't know a whole lot about him growing up for some of the reasons I've already talked about because of my own family situation. My dad, as I said, struggled with alcoholism. He was a World War II vet. And like a lot of his generation, he just, the things that he saw, he was part of Normandy, got the Purple Heart. I think alcohol helped him deal with those demons. But added to that was my mom, who was very fragile and had some mental illness. And so, really, just surviving was kind of the rule of the day for my little family. And so, this aspect of my history and this man and the Denver Art Museum, which he was part of, really was on the margins. My wonderful grandmother, her name was Frida. She's the one that really, brought me into this world. One day she came into my bedroom because she had moved in, and after my dad died, she kind of stabilized my mom and all the craziness that was going on. And she had a supplement from the Denver Post called Empire Magazine. And on the cover was this beautiful log home up in Evergreen, west of Denver. And this was where she lived with Eric, with Poppy. And she said, Jack, I think you need to hang on to this because it's about our family. Because she didn't talk much about it. She said, it's kind of an interesting story. I was a long-haired hippie kid. I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it till many, many years later. The Denver Art Museum called me out of the blue. They had tracked me down. This was long after a lot of the Douglas family had died off, including my mom and my grandmother. They said, you're connected with Eric Douglas, right? I said, well, yeah, he was my grandfather. Well, we have a society here at the Denver Art Museum called the Douglas Society. Will you come and lecture? Give us a lecture about your grandfather. Whoa! I panicked. I mean, I was used to handling a lot of stuff in the newsroom, but this was big time. And I had to be honest. I said, look, I have a supplement from the Denver Post from the 1970s, but I don't know a whole lot more, but I'll do my best. So I did some quick cramming, and I found out some things about him that I then put into this 90-minute lecture that I did with some multimedia. But I realized this did not do the man justice when I really started understanding all the things that he was part of in terms of contacting these native artists and convincing them of the fact that they needed their work to be showcased in a museum and the way he went about showcasing it. And so that's why I wrote the book. I felt I didn't want this man getting lost to history because the Douglas Society was composed at that time of people that actually knew him, but they were in their 80s and 90s and they weren't going to be around much longer. And so I thought, I need to put this down in a book, initially for my family. But then as I started telling other people, they said, really, I'd never heard this story. And so, I took 2 years. I accessed notes and diaries, letters, because they were letter writers back in the day. And I camped in some of the places where they camped to try to get a real feel for what they went through. And so the result with this book, and I'm very pleased with the reception of it because I think it does, not only highlight what he did, but also a lot of these native artists that, weren't respected in their time. And he helped white America in particular appreciate what they, contributed, not only, from a historic perspective, but from a contemporary one, because he never looked at their art as something ethnographic or anthropologic. It was contemporary art that he wanted, people to know this needs to be not only in a museum, but in your home. Think about supporting these artists because they're still making the art. They're not, trapped in some dusty, display case. This is a vibrant, living culture. And so he tried to meet, these people that would come into the museum on their terms to help them understand why this was not just some kitschy souvenir that you could get down in Santa Fe, but it was a beautiful piece of pottery that not only had this history to it, but a sheen of contemporary beauty that could be, part of their home and the way that they viewed this kind of art. If I can tell you just a little bit about what led him to appreciate this culture, his father was an Episcopalian minister, and he was from the New York area, and he had a habit of working himself into exhaustion. And he was a music liturgist. He loved ancient plain song, which is sort of a Gregorian chant, and he wanted to make that more mainstream. And so that's how he dedicated his life. But he was found one day at the base of his organ, passed out from exhaustion. And his superiors said, you need to go west. That's kind of the cure back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. You go west, get some fresh air in those lungs of yours. Try to refresh yourself. He did, and he took a horse and a bedroll, and he went and he camped out under the stars for months at a time. And in the course of this, his name was Winfred Douglas, Father Douglas. He encountered Hopi people. And he just had a way about him that even though he didn't really know much about them, they took him into their world and they helped him to learn their traditions and their cultures and their art and ultimately their language. And they adopted him as a blood brother. They gave him the name of Lomawana, which meant tall pine tree. He was a very tall man. And this love of not only the Hopi, but the Santa Clara, the Pueblo, the Navajo, he just he fell in love with everything about their world. And that transmitted to his son, Eric, who then brought it into the museum world. And I am so proud of these guys and, the fact that they recognized that this was something that needed to be done at a time when there was a lot of racist attitudes about Native Americans and the things they created.
In terms of, I get, well, you already mentioned a good part of it was just, familial. Do you think if you do write another book, do you think it'll be something like kind of personal to you and more of like a nonfiction story?
Hmm. Well, I did do that. I did do that. Actually, my second book is probably the most personal book I've written. It was a hard book to write. Uh, it is actually about my late wife, Becky, and a very beautiful encounter she had with a stranger at our Catholic church here in Colorado. And the remarkable thing that happened in that encounter almost 7 years ago now. And the book is called You Were Chosen Just Like Mary. And it's about, what the stranger said to her and what happened subsequently. And without getting into too many of the details, I will tell you that it has set me on a personal quest, a spiritual odyssey, if you will, to try to understand what happened that night, how I believe and my family believes God broke into this world to show us something remarkable. And this odyssey has brought me to the Holy Land right before the war broke out on a pilgrimage. I went on a pilgrimage to Marian apparition sites um, because we Catholics believe Mary has appeared, to particularly young people throughout history. And then most recently, I just returned from Italy on another pilgrimage, and I'm starting to really just see through a much clearer lens just how incredible the events of that encounter between Becky and this stranger were. And I put everything I had into it, Kemdi. I really did, and it was emotionally very hard, but also quite beautiful. So I think for the next book, I think I'm probably going to do something else. I'm not sure. I'm kind of toying with maybe a book of short stories, fiction, but we'll see. I just kind of, it's wherever the heart leads me.
Okay. You did mention Italy. I just wanted to ask a little more about travels in terms of, is that something you've done more as you've gotten older, or yeah, like, and
Yeah,
like what's your experience been like kind of like
yeah.
visiting all these kind of new places?
Kind of like we talked about when even just going, south to Las Cruces, and when you expose yourself to a new culture and new languages and new food, it just broadens the horizons in a way that is beautiful and that it sticks with you. It makes you realize just how beautiful this world is and how silly it is that we are in a place sometimes where, there is such divisiveness because there's so much that unites us. I was able to go to Rome, and as a Catholic, that's a big deal, going to the Vatican and seeing the art that's in there, seeing the relics that are scattered throughout the city. Went to Assisi, where there are some saints that are there that you can venerate. That's another big part of the Catholic experience. One of them is the most recent Catholic saint, St. Carlos Acutis. He's called the Millennial Saint because he actually, was a teenager who used his computer to document and chronicle Eucharistic miracles, um, and started a website. Died at a very young age, and he is there at Assisi because he wanted to be uh, buried in the same place where Saint Francis was, because he revered him, which is another Catholic saint. And you would not believe how many young people are flocking to Assisi as a result of this millennial saint. And I think it's great to see how it's revitalized the church in a lot of ways, in terms of the young people that are, starting to realize, oh, okay, maybe I can be a saint too, just like this guy, and learning about his life and everything. Um, but I was on a trip with a number of students from a college in Colorado Springs. Some, are just learning about their faith. Some are really deep into it, and having those conversations, again, it narrows the age gap. I mean, I'm 71. A lot of these kids were in their 20s. I mean, I have suits older than a lot of them, but it was lovely. It was a lovely experience, exchanging what was in our hearts. And so I would just say, if you have that opportunity, whether it's just traveling to the next state or if it's, hopping a flight to go across the world, if you're lucky enough to do that, take advantage of that, break out of your own little shell that you might be in, because it's a beautiful world and we only have a finite number of days to enjoy it.
Okay. I only have one more question left for you. It's just, was there any piece of advice you got through your kind of your journey, that you still like hold with you to this day, and you kind of like would like love to like kind of like impart on anyone that may be watching this episode in the future?
Well, again, it relates to my deep faith. Just be grateful. Be grateful for every day. I wake up every day with a prayer. Thank you for another day. Thank you for giving me another set of breath to be able to experience what you want me to experience. Give me an open heart and an open mind so that I can see what you want me to see and feel what you want me to feel. And I feel such peace after I say that prayer, because in a way you're letting somebody else take the wheel to, kind of calling that old tired cliche, but it's true. Be curious, be endlessly curious. Never stop learning. That's something that my grandfather, Poppy, said on his deathbed to my aunt. Never stop learning. It's good advice.
Thank you. I really appreciate this interview. It was really insightful. I've known a lot about the news in the past, from other previous people I've worked for, and just like other authors I've interviewed. But this has been a very insightful interview. I can tell you're very passionate about what you used to do and what you still currently do. I appreciate you. I appreciate you taking the time to just talk and um, kind of just pour everything out here. So thank you.
Well, thank you for giving me the time and the space. You really, your podcast is one of those rarities that actually cuts through the noise. So keep up the good work.